Now, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development says the rules of origin is the gatekeeper of continental regional integration. Mukhisa Kituyi, the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, discussed how the rules of origin could impact the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement.
If you see the core promise of a continental integration is to create more African value, more African jobs by enhanced African business accessing African markets. Rules of origin is the passport that guarantees that a product is made in Africa. And if you have to give preferences as a basis of regional integration and a free trade area, then the passport becomes important on how to discriminate against those who don't qualify for the same preference. So the rules of origin are critical in ensuring that what you allow in without tariffs is actually a product of a complying country in Africa.
All right, now, so let's look at some other sub-criteria that this would also involve. We understand that there's a need for the change of tariff classification. We also understand that the ad valorem percentage is also important, and also the specific manufacturing or processing operations are also important. And I would like to know how this nexus works together.
Over the past 30 years, actually 40 years since Abuja, the underlying assumption about African integration was that when the regional economic commissions will negotiate tariff arrangements, as they integrate, they become the building blocks for a Pan-African free trade area. The problem is that each regional economic commission had its own bands and percentages, height of tariff barriers for goods and products coming from outside the region. For example, regions like SADC, which had a strong industrial economy in South Africa, bid high industrial tariffs. And regions without significant industry were not under similar pressure. So you found that the industrial tariffs were relatively lower. Now where we are is trying to create one common free trade area with very different tracks of customs tariff banding. So the end of the day, made in Africa can only drive African prosperity if you can demonstrate that African products have preference in the African market. So that's one. The second thing, and very importantly, Africa's average export to the rest of the world represent only 15% value added. But products exported from an African country to another African country, on average, are more than 40% value added, which means the more we trade with each other, the more we create jobs at home. There's more value in what we trade with each other than what we trade with the rest of the world. And creating a system that protects the integrity of that market from competition, from dumping by other countries outside the African continent becomes an important consideration. Now, how is this going to be enforced? At the end of the day, signing on to the African Free Trade Agreement is a statement that you trust the other African countries that they will be their brother's keeper. And eventually the Africa Union Free Trade Area Secretariat in Accra, Ghana, will have to build a capacity to respond to alarms, notifications about and red flags about illicit products being dumped into the free trade area, or any breach of the rules that are governing the free trade area, the free trade agreement.
All right, now let's look into the design now. In your view, what is best practice in trying to design, the rules of origin?
The most important is twofold. The first thing is rules of origin have to be simple, transparent, and predictable. If you make rules too complicated, they will become part of the bureaucratic red tape that slows down the movement of goods and services. There will be difficult and there will be disputes about their fair application. If the rules of origin are unpredictable, they bring an uncertainty that is wrong for investors to plan and budget in their decisions about production and marketing. So trying to make the rules too complicated because of fears of what can come in can have a consequence of making things not move at all. So it has to combine simplicity, transparency, and predictability with political goodwill. a new phenomenon like this, where countries are lowering their expected returns from tariffs, which to many of these countries are an important source of public revenue, requires political will. And that political will comes in exchange with a promise of integrity and failure to abuse the system.
All right then, but looking at Sub-Saharan Africa, we have a lot of regional economic communities
Yeah.
in the region, and then trying to create that somewhat, convergence between the regulators, that's still going to be an uphill task.
The thing is that to a large extent, countries going through the creation of a region of free trade area or regional economic commission, some going as far as a common market, a customs union, it has been a learning experience about what are the levers in the technical negotiation. Many of the country technical teams have built a negotiating capacity going through that process. Similarly, support institutions like my own are targeting the regional economic commissions as the locus at which we help to train national officers, for example, on how to make services offers in the liberalization of services export. What are the remedial defensive mechanisms? How can you get suspend in the case of a surge in imports, sensitive products? How can you stagger obligations and commitments? All these are part of the process that has been learned to a large extent by belonging to the communities. But also the regional economic communities have taught the African population what not to do. There are some things which are very important. For example, you can agree about the rules, about tariffs, and then you discover that the biggest challenge and impediment to trade is not tariffs, it is non-tariff measures. Whether it is excessive availability of roadblocks, too many weigh bridges, government officers pretending they don't know your rights as a trader, cumbersome cross-border transactional documents. These are actually a bigger challenge to intra-African trade than tariffs. So the experience that has been learned on how to identify and deal with non-tariff measures is one of the most important learning experiences from the REX that can now inform the continental ambition.
Let's move on now to some risks. I'm reading from your report, I saw something very interesting. It's mentioned in the report that, commercial interests might enter into the framing of the rules of origin. I would like you to speak on what the dangers of this could mean and how we could mitigate against such.
I have the experience as a former trade minister. When I negotiated the Customs Union of East Africa, one of the challenges we found is that your entrepreneurs, business community from the capitals, who are dependent on inputs from third parties, for example, textile manufacturers who are importing either fabric or spun yarn from East Asia, for example, would like rules of origin which allows them a large percentage of non-local inputs in getting the passport of made in the region. Now, what we're saying about being careful is that we should not get into a situation where vested interests of business individuals or enterprises, particularly those which want to keep at the minimum the requirements for local value addition, start softening rules of origin to allow excess value addition abroad outside Africa to come into the region. The consequence of that is, of course, that industrialization fails, and that is what touches to President Buhari's sentiment. Look at the example of AGOA. Under AGOA, the negotiating African countries were given a waiver that a very substantial part of the product they're making could come from countries that are outside the AGOA community. What did it mean? That a lot of African countries will import canvas from East Asia, cut, stitch, and package it, and send it to America as made in Africa. And the consequence of that is that it did not build upstream value chains in the African textile industry. If you compare that with the economic partnership agreement with the European Union insisted a high percentage of the inputs in any textile going to Europe from Africa under EPA has to be no, not EPA, the everything but arms. That the high percentage of what you import into Europe from countries that benefit from everything but arms, has to be locally produced or in a country that also qualifies. The output of that has been that those who exported to Europe under the anything but arms provision have created value chains from cotton to yarning to fabric making to textile manufacture. And that is the path of industrialization we have to emphasize. Don't go easy on those who want easy gains by reducing the requirements of local content in what you call made in Africa.
All right, so finally, sir, before we end this conversation, I would like you to get some of your recommendations. I read something very interesting in your report talking about getting the right mix of the rules of origin and sector-specific industrial policy. I'd like you to just put this together for me and make me understand this better.
If there's anything that has been demonstrated in the cases of those who have used regional integration to industrialize, is that industrialization does not happen accidentally. There has to be purposeful action, aligning industrial policy with labor policies, with macroeconomic policies, with investment promotional policies, and trade facilitation policies. Now, if the promise of a continental free trade area is not just about mercantilist movement of goods around Africa, but Africa's route to industrialization, there must be built purposeful networks of production, cross-border value chains that will lead to additional value in African produce before it reaches African and other international markets. I can give an example. Today, the largest producers of chocolate in Africa are South Africa and Egypt. Most of the cocoa that goes into those chocolate comes from Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. But nearly 95% of the cocoa paste used for making chocolate in Egypt and South Africa is imported from Belgium and Switzerland. What it means is that cocoa from West Africa is going to Europe to be turned into a paste, an exercise that's not it's a no-brainer. It's also no brain surgery. I mean, really a very basic process before being sent back to Africa to be turned into chocolate. A purposeful creation of value chains is now to say, can we address what challenges have disincentivized linking the cocoa-producing countries in Africa with the chocolate-making countries in Africa? So the process of creating rules of origin should be such that you do not disincentivize the cross-border movement of intermediate goods relevant to prioritized value addition and manufacturing sectors on the continent. This is the only way you're going to make competitive production in Africa, to conquer the African market and start being relevant to the global market.
I've been speaking to Mukhisa Kituyi. He's the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And that's it on Beyond Markets, and thank you so much for joining me on the show. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West Africa time daily and have access to all previous episodes of Beyond Markets on our website, and that's at cnbcafrica.com. You can stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets and follow me at Kenneth Ibomo. Do have a wonderful day.